Each turned their faces sidewise and upward. The crowd on the fence scuffled for better positions. The people in the trees craned their necks from the branches or climbed higher, and there was a great scraping on all the roofs. Even the black crowd out on the hills seemed to catch the excitement and to sway, while spots of intense blue and vivid crimson came out here and there from the blackness, when the women rose from their seats on the ground. Then sharply there was silence. The sheriff disappeared, and shut in by the sashless window as by a picture frame, and blinking in the strong light, stood a man with black hair cropped close, face pale and worn, and hands that looked white and thin. Stood Bad Rufe Tolliver. He was going to confess. That was the rumor. His lawyers wanted him to confess. The preacher who had been singing hymns with him all morning wanted him to confess. The man himself said he wanted to confess. And now he was going to confess. What deadly mysteries he might clear up if he would. No wonder the crowd was eager, for there was no soul there but knew his record. And what a record! His best friends put his victims no lower than 13, and there looking up at him were 3 women whom he had widowed or orphaned, while at one corner of the jail yard stood a girl in black, the sweetheart of Mockaby, for whose death Rufe was standing where he stood now. But his lips did not open. Instead, he took hold of the side of the window and looked behind him. The sheriff brought him a chair, and he sat down. Apparently he was weak, and he was going to wait a while. Would he tell how he killed one Fallon in the presence of the latter's wife at a wild bee tree? How he had killed a sheriff by dropping to the ground when the sheriff fired in this way, dodging the bullet, and then shooting the officer from where he lay, supposedly dead? How he had thrown another Fallon out of the courthouse window and broken his neck? The Fallon was drunk, Rufe always said, and fell out. Why, then, he was constable. He had killed another because, Rufe said, he resisted arrest. How and where he had killed Redneck Johnson, who was found out in the woods. Would he tell all that and more? If he meant to tell, there was no sign. His lips kept closed, and his bright black eyes were studying the situation. The little squads of youngsters, back to back, with their repeating shotguns, the line of Fallons along the wall toward whom protruded 6 shining barrels, the huddled crowd of Tollivers toward whom protruded 6 more, old Judd towering in front with young Dave on one side, tense as a leopard about to spring, and on the other Bub with tears streaming down his face. In a flash he understood, and in that flash his face looked as though he had been suddenly struck a heavy blow by someone from behind. And then his elbows dropped on the sill of the window, his chin dropped into his hands, and a murmur arose. Maybe he was too weak to stand and talk. Perhaps he was going to talk from his chair. Yes, he was leaning forward, and his lips were opening, but no sound came. Slowly his eyes wandered around at the waiting people, in the trees, on the roofs and the fence, and then they dropped to old Judd's and blazed their appeal for a sign. With one heave of his mighty chest, old Judd took off his slouch hat, pressed one big hand to the back of his head, and, despite that blazing appeal, kept it there. At that moment Rufe threw his head up as though his breath had suddenly failed him. His face turned sickening white, and slowly again his chin dropped into his trembling hands, and still unbelieving he stared his appeal. But old Judd dropped his big hand and turned his head away. The condemned man's mouth twitched once, settling into defiant calm, and then he did one kindly thing. He turned in his seat and motioned Bob Berkley, who was just behind him, away from the window, and the boy, to humor him, stepped aside. Then he rose to his feet and stretched his arms wide. Simultaneously came the far-away crack of a rifle, and as a jet of smoke spurred above a clump of bushes on a little hill 300 yards away, Bad Rufe wheeled halfway round and fell back out of sight into the sheriff's arms. Every Fallon made a nervous reach for his pistol. The line of gun muzzles covering them wavered slightly, but the Tollivers stood still and unsurprised. And when Hale dashed from the door again, there was a grim smile of triumph on old Judd's face. He had kept his promise that Rufe should never hang. "Steady there," said Hale quietly, his pistol on his hip now, and the Winchester was in his left hand. "Stand where you are, everybody." There was a sound of hurrying feet within the jail. There was the clang of an iron door, the bang of a wooden one, and in 5 minutes from within the tall wooden box came the sharp click of a hatchet, and then, dully, thump! The dangling rope had tightened with a snap, and the wind swayed it no more. At his cell door the Red Fox stood with his watch and his eyes glued to the second hand. When it had gone 3 times around its circuit, he snapped the lid with a sigh of relief and turned to his hammock and his Bible. "It's gone now," said the Red Fox. Outside Hale still waited, and his eyes turned from the Tollivers to the Falins. 7 of the faces among them came back to him with startling distinctness, and his mind went back to the opening trouble in the county seat over the Kentucky line years before, when 8 men held one another at the points of their pistols. One face was missing, and that face belonged to Rufe Tolliver. Hale pulled out his watch. "Keep those men there," he said, pointing to the Falins, and he turned to the bewildered Tollivers. "Come on, Judd," he said kindly, "all of you." Dazed and mystified, they followed him in a body around the corner of the jail, where in a coffin that old Judd had sent to the blind to his real purpose lay the remains of Bad Rufe Tolliver, with a harmless bullet hole through one shoulder. Near by was a wagon, and hitched to it were 2 mules that Hale himself had provided. Hale pointed to it. "Done all I could, Judd. Take him away. I'll keep the Falins under guard until you reach the Kentucky line, so that they can't waylay you." If old Judd heard, he gave no sign. He was looking down at the face of his foster brother. His shoulder drooped, his great frame shrunken, and his iron face beaten and helpless. Again Hale spoke. "I'm sorry for all this. I'm even sorry that your man was not a better shot." The old man straightened. Then, with a gesture, he motioned young Dave to the foot of the coffin, and stooped himself at the head. Past the wagon they went, the crowd giving way before them, and with the dead Tolliver on their shoulders, old Judd and young Dave passed with their followers out of sight. End of chapter 29.